For 9 seasons, Everybody Loves Raymond sat in millions of living rooms as one of the most comfortable, familiar shows on television. It looked effortless. A bickering couple, a meddling mother-in-law, a mismatched brother, and a dad who barely spoke unless it counted. But comfort on screen rarely comes without effort behind it, and the woman at the emotional center of that sitcom, Patricia Heaton, was carrying more than her share of the weight the entire time the cameras rolled. Now in her 60s, Heaton has spoken more openly over the years about what those 9 years actually cost her, what she hid from audiences without anyone noticing, and what it meant to build a career playing a mother while quietly navigating her own motherhood just off camera. This is the story of what was really happening behind Debra Barone's exasperated sighs and perfectly timed one-liners. Before she was Debra Barone, Patricia Heaton was a working actress with a resume full of near misses. She had already appeared in short-lived series and guest spots throughout the late 80s and early 90s, building a reputation as a sharp comedic performer without ever landing the role that would define her. When she auditioned for Everybody Loves Raymond in 1996, she was up against strong competition, including performers the network liked for different reasons. What set Heaton apart, according to people who worked on the show, was her ability to play frustration without becoming shrill and warmth without becoming saccharine. Debra needed to be a woman who loved her husband and resented him in the same breath, and Heaton found that balance almost immediately in the room. What audiences never saw was how personal that balancing act would become. Heaton was already a mother when she took the role, and by the time the series wrapped, she would have 5 children. 2 of those pregnancies happened during production, and both were kept off the audience's radar through careful wardrobe choices, blocking, and camera work that the crew treated as a normal, if quietly demanding, part of the job. Concealing a pregnancy on a single camera drama is one thing. Doing it on a multi-camera sitcom shot in front of a live studio audience, week after week, is a different challenge entirely. Everybody Loves Raymond followed a tight production rhythm. Table reads early in the week, rewrites and rehearsals through Tuesday, and Wednesday, camera blocking by Thursday, and a live taping in front of an audience on Friday night. There was very little room to hide anything for long, because the show was essentially performed live in front of witnesses every single week. Costume designers leaned on loose blouses, structured jackets, and oversized sweaters that fit the character's suburban mom aesthetic anyway, which made the concealment easier than it might have been on a show with a different wardrobe style. The directors adjusted blocking so that Heaton was seated behind furniture, holding props, or angled away from the audience during scenes where her figure might have given something away. Editors and camera operators who noticed the choreography simply treated it as part of the job and said nothing. It worked. Most viewers had no idea that the actress playing an overworked, perpetually exasperated mother of 3 was, in real life, expecting again. Heaton has since described that period as physically exhausting in a way audiences could never appreciate from the screen. Sitcom filming already asks a lot of a performer's body. Standing for hours during blocking, repeating physical comedy multiple times for different camera angles, and holding energy for a live audience at the end of a long week. Doing that while pregnant and doing it in a way specifically designed so nobody would notice added a layer of strain that never once showed up in the finished episodes. Heaton's connection to the role went beyond hiding pregnancies. She has said in interviews over the years that much of what made Debra believable to her personally was how closely the character's exhaustion mirrored her own life. Off-screen, she was raising 4 boys with her husband at the time, actor David Hunt, while working the demanding schedule of a network sitcom. The show's writers, many of whom were drawing from their own family lives and from creator Philip Rosenthal's Real Marriage, often built storylines around the kind of domestic friction that doesn't require exaggeration, just accurate observation. Heaton didn't need to imagine what it felt like to be interrupted mid-sentence by a child, or to feel invisible in her own household. She was living a version of it while filming a fictional version of it. That overlap gave the character an authenticity that resonated far beyond the show's premise. Debra Barone became one of television's most relatable depictions of a modern wife and mother precisely because Heaton wasn't performing a concept. She was performing a heightened, funnier version of her own exhaustion, frustration, and love, filtered through someone else's family name. Debra's defining tension on the show was always her sense of being unseen. Ray adored her in his own clumsy way, but the writing consistently placed her at the center of a household where her labor, her patience, and her sacrifices went unacknowledged by almost everyone around her, especially her mother-in-law, Marie. It made for excellent comedy, but Heaton has acknowledged that playing a character defined by being overlooked week after week for 9 years wasn't always easy to leave at the studio door. She has spoken about walking away from certain episodes carrying real frustration, not because of anything happening in her personal marriage, but because performing that particular emotional register repeatedly required tapping into something genuine. Comedy asks performers to locate real feeling and then heighten it for laughs. And Heaton became skilled enough at that process that the show's writers increasingly built entire storylines around her ability to convey quiet resentment with a single look. The skill came at a cost that rarely made it into behind-the-scenes footage or press junkets. Part of what made the concealment of Heaton's pregnancies possible was the trust that had developed among the cast. Ray, Romano, Brad Garrett, Doris Roberts, and Peter Boyle were not just co-stars by the time the show hit its stride. They had become genuinely close, protective of each other in ways that extended off-camera. That closeness showed up in other quiet dramas that played out during production. Dramas the audience also never saw. Peter Boyle, who played the gruff, often unreadable patriarch Frank Barone, was diagnosed with a serious illness in the early 2000s and chose to keep the news private, sharing it with only a small circle that included Doris Roberts, his on-screen wife. Roberts reportedly told him that the rest of the cast didn't need to treat him differently. They just needed to keep writing good material for him. And Boyle took that advice seriously, continuing to work at his usual pace without letting the diagnosis show. He passed away in December 2006, a little over a year after the series ended, and colleagues who worked with him during those final seasons later said they had no idea how much he was carrying while still delivering some of the show's sharpest comedic timing. Brad Garrett dealt with his own private struggle during the earlier seasons of the show, later acknowledging that he had been drinking heavily while filming and functioning well enough that it went largely unnoticed by audiences and, for a time, by some of his colleagues. He has since spoken candidly about getting sober before the show's momentum carried him further into a lifestyle that could have derailed his career entirely, crediting the discipline of a weekly production schedule with helping him recognize the problem before it became unmanageable. None of this was visible in the finished episodes. What audiences saw was a tightly performed ensemble comedy with flawless timing. What was actually happening involved a cast quietly managing addiction, illness, and pregnancy, all while delivering some of the most technically demanding physical comedy on network television. Not every hidden conflict on Everybody Loves Raymond was medical or personal. As the show's ratings climbed through the early 2000s, a significant pay disparity opened up between Ray Romano and the rest of the ensemble, Heaton included. Romano's earnings eventually reached well into 7 figures per episode, while his co-stars, despite being just as essential to the show's chemistry, were paid a fraction of that amount. The imbalance became difficult to ignore, and at one point several cast members, led publicly by Brad Garrett, pushed back hard enough that production was disrupted while new terms were negotiated. Heaton has described that period as uncomfortable but necessary, a moment where the cast had to advocate for itself as a unit rather than accept whatever structure had been set early in the show's run before anyone understood how big it would become. The dispute was resolved without lasting damage to the group's relationships, but it exposed something the audience never got to see: that the effortless on-screen chemistry didn't mean everything behind the scenes was equally effortless or equally fair. By the time the series wrapped its 9th season in 2005, the cast had spent nearly a decade building something that had stopped feeling like a job and started feeling like an extended family, complicated history included. Heaton has said that filming the final episodes was far more emotional than she expected going in. During one of the last rehearsals, she became so overwhelmed that she lost her voice entirely and the taping had to be pushed back, a moment that surprised even her, given how long she had trained herself to compartmentalize during production. The ending of the show also meant closing the door on a version of her professional life built almost entirely around motherhood, both fictional and real. She would go on to headline the middle a few years later, playing another overworked mother in another sprawling family comedy. A role she has said felt like a natural continuation of everything she had learned playing Debra, minus the pressure of hiding a pregnancy from a studio audience. In interviews conducted well after the show ended, Heaton has been candid about how physically and emotionally demanding those 9 years actually were, even as she describes them as some of the best years of her career. She has talked about the strange experience of watching reruns with her own children, now adults, and being struck by how much of her real exhaustion is visible in hindsight, even though it was invisible to audiences at the time. She has also spoken about the responsibility she felt playing a character so many women recognized as an accurate reflection of their own lives, a responsibility that meant she rarely allowed herself to phone in a performance, even during weeks when she was privately dealing with a pregnancy, a scheduling conflict, or simple physical fatigue. What emerges from those interviews isn't a story of resentment. It's a portrait of an actress who understood early on that comedy, this specific, this rooted in the mundane friction of real family life, only works if the performer bringing it to life is willing to draw from something true. Heaton did that consistently for 9 years, often while concealing exactly how true it was. It would have been easy for Everybody Loves Raymond to write around a pregnancy rather than hide one. Plenty of sitcoms have done exactly that, incorporating a pregnancy into the storyline itself. The choice to conceal it instead speaks to something specific about how the show operated. The writers wanted Debra Barone's world to stay consistent, grounded in the specific family structure that had already been established, rather than shifting the show's internal timeline to accommodate a real-life event. That decision placed the burden entirely on Heaton and the production team tasked with disguising what was happening in plain sight week after week, in front of a live audience that had no idea what it was witnessing. It's a small detail in the grand scope of a 9-season sitcom, but it captures something true about the show as a whole. What looked effortless almost never was. Behind Debra's perfectly timed exasperation was an actress managing a demanding physical reality. Behind Frank's gruff one-liners was a man quietly fighting an illness. And behind the ensemble's easy chemistry was a group of people navigating real personal struggles, while making one of the most technically difficult genres in television look like the easiest thing in the world. Nearly 2 decades after the series ended, Everybody Loves Raymond remains a fixture in syndication, still finding new audiences who have no idea about any of what was happening off-camera during its original run. That's arguably part of its lasting appeal. The show was built on the premise that ordinary family life, with all its friction and repetition, could be funny without being exaggerated. It turns out the people making that show were living out their own version of that premise the entire time, managing real pregnancies, real illness, real financial disputes, and real personal battles, all while making sure none of it interrupted the laughter. Patricia Heaton, now in her 60s and reflecting on a career that has spanned decades since her time on that Long Island set, has never framed what she went through as a scandal. It wasn't a secret in the tabloid sense. It was simply the ordinary, invisible labor that goes into making something look easy, the kind of effort audiences rarely think about, because the entire point of the performance is to make sure they don't have to.